Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I just want to start out today by saying a huge thank you to everyone who has reached out. I've gotten so many emails and DMs and messages over the past week or so of people letting me know that they are listening to the podcast, episodes that they're loving, and all of that sort of feedback. And I just want to say a huge shout out because sometimes podcasting is a little bit of a strange feeling because it's kind of a one-way street and you sort of put this content out and you have no idea who's listening to it, who's taking it on board, what people are finding useful, what is landing with people. So I just wanted to say thank you. I've had so many people reach out over the past week. So if you want to reach out, send me a DM, send me an email. I would love to hear from you and know kind of what's resonating and what's landing with you. Anyway, we are going to get into today's podcast episode, and today we are talking all about rest and recovery. So depending on when you're listening to this, the podcast is dropping on December 21st, which is right before the holiday break for a lot of people. Some people might be still in the middle of their Nutcracker run, but a lot of people are kind of wrapping up. So it seemed like an appropriate time to talk about rest and recovery in dancers. And this is a topic that definitely, I think there's a little bit of pushback from in the dance community, although maybe people realize that rest and recovery is important, and there's sort of buzzwords right now, not just in the dance world, but just kind of in general. If you're in the health and wellness space, there's a lot of talk about rest and recovery, but in reality, dancers still maybe don't embrace it as much as they should, or utilize it to the best of their advantage. So, like I said, this seemed like an opportune time to dive into this topic as we head into what is hopefully a little bit of a winter break for a lot of dancers. So we're going to talk about different types of recovery and the benefits of them and sort of why rest and recovery is important today. But before we get into that, it's important that we understand a definition of what recovery actually is. Because like I said, this word or this topic is getting thrown around a lot, but I think people don't always necessarily know exactly what they're talking about when we talk about recovery. So if we look at the actual definition of recovery, or one definition of recovery, recovery is the ability of a person or a person's body to regain function after a session or an activity. And it is dependent on previous levels of function and also the healing process. So there's a couple of things to unpack within that, but really it comes down to regaining function that happens after every session or activity we do. So recovery is a little bit different than healing, in that healing is generally something that occurs after we've had an injury or we've had the sort of damage happening to tissues or to the body or that sort of thing. Whereas recovery is something that happens after every session. So every rehearsal, every class we have, there is a certain amount of recovery that needs to be happening after that. And one of the things that I want to kind of tease out of that definition too is that recovery is really dependent on our previous level of functioning. So what we see often in dancers, and not just in dancers, but we see it commonly in dancers, is that we kind of get into these chronic levels of depletion where we're maybe demanding a lot from our body over, a day of rehearsals or a week of rehearsals or whatever the period of time is. And if we're not adequately recovering from those sessions, maybe we recover 60% and then we go into the next session and we deplete things a little bit more, and then maybe we're only recovering 50% after that. And maybe those numbers aren't even that low. Maybe we go in and initially we're recovering kind of to 90 or 95%. But then as that sort of accumulates over time, then if we're going into the next session already slightly depleted, our ability to recover becomes even harder. So then maybe we only recover to 85%, and then we recover to 80%. And you can see how it can become a bit of this downward spiral. And I think that's what we often see in the dance industry is we go so long without prioritizing rest or recovery and really just pushing the body to its limits that it's not just one incident that pushes things over the edge. It's this sort of spiral that happens, downward spiral that happens over time, where eventually we get people who are so depleted that the body breaks down. And that can look like an injury that happens. It can look like illnesses that happen. It can be all sorts of things like that. And it's not necessarily just physical too. This also impacts our the mental side of things. And so we can have people who just go into total burnout or potentially are struggling with mental health issues like depression or anxiety. So it's all linked together. So recovery has to be something that we prioritize, not just, once a year in summer break, if we're lucky enough to get one, or in this sort of winter break sort of season, but it's something that has to be prioritized on a daily basis, but certainly on if we look at cycles of a weekly basis. And this ties a little bit into that concept of periodization that we were talking about before, or when we talk about training loads, making sure that we have rest and recovery days built into our schedule. No dancer should be dancing 7 days a week, and especially no adolescent dancer. So if we have dancers that are still growing and younger dancers, they absolutely should not be dancing 7 days a week. We need rest and recovery built into that. But even when we get to higher levels like professional dancers, we cannot be expecting dancers to be able to perform without having days for rest and recovery. A lot of sort of professional company settings and stuff might have one rest day a week. So they might have, a day where there's no performances. It's often a Monday will be a day off for companies. And then they kind of perform, Tuesday to Sunday or that sort of thing. And in, the more studio dance world or competitive dance world, sometimes dancers have days off in their schedule. But what I see really commonly is those days get filled with extra rehearsals or solo practices or workshops or master classes or things like that. And although there's really, exciting things that dancers can partake in, sometimes we need to look at the bigger picture and say, is it really a good idea for me to go and do that, masterclass opportunity or whatever it is when I actually haven't had a day off from my schedule for the last 14 days or whatever it is. So we need to consider that on an ongoing basis, not just at times where there should be sort of a break in the calendar. We also are seeing more and more saturation in the schedules when there should be breaks in calendars. So what we look at, the winter break that's coming up, and I'm seeing ads pop up all over the place for winter intensives and winter training opportunities. And again, although oftentimes it's a really, really great opportunity to work with maybe different teachers or choreographers you don't normally work with, at what cost? When is your next break going to be? When is the next time that dancer is going to have a break and be able to rest and recover? So do we need to prioritize that over the winter break rather than potentially jumping into all these other training opportunities? So just some food for thought when we think about rest and recovery and how we implement it, not just on a daily basis, but also when we're looking at our training cycles and how it ties into that sort of periodization piece of things. So we're going to talk about different types of recovery because there are different sort of things we can do to recover, different ways that people will promote recovery. So we generally break this down into what we call active recovery and passive recovery. And I'm going to talk about active recovery first. So active recovery is when we participate in sort of a low intensity activity or exercise, depending on how you want to look at it, that's done after we've performed a strenuous activity. So examples of this would be our strenuous activity is generally our dance classes. So we've had our dance classes or rehearsals or performances or whatever it is, and we may have an active recovery day the next day. And so that might not mean that you are doing nothing, but it means that the intensity of what you're doing is going to be intentionally significantly lower. And so the activities that you might be doing might be things like walking or going swimming or maybe light cycling or gentle stretching or yoga or things like that. So we can still be moving our body, but it's going to be at an intensity that is intentionally significantly lower. Active recovery becomes really important if you are a dance teacher or a studio owner, but specifically a dance teacher, and you have kids who have just participated in high levels of strenuous activities. So again, high levels of rehearsals, performances, things like that. And a really easy example of that is conventions. So we have dancers that commonly participate in weekend conventions. So they're probably there like Friday afternoon, evening, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, super long hours, really high energy, really high intensity. But then they're coming back into the studio on Monday. And because of the way studio schedules are set up and because of the way tuition is paid and parents are paying for classes, generally we're not necessarily canceling classes on those days. Sometimes we can and make them up at different times, but oftentimes you have these dancers coming into the studio, but they're already going to be really, really depleted. And so those days, or at least the first day, but ideally maybe even the first couple of days after they've participated in something really strenuous like a convention, we really want to prioritize rest and recovery. And so that's where active recovery can be really beneficial. So maybe we have a day where we just focus on doing some gentle yoga, and then maybe we're doing stuff that's even more passive recovery, things like journaling, things like self-reflection on, the experience that they had over the weekend at the convention, stuff like that. But we can use this concept of active recovery to still be able to teach our dancers in a class setting, knowing that they're coming into the studio, but also realizing that it is recovery that we need to prioritize at that time. The benefits of active recovery are that we get increased or improved blood flow going to the muscles or parts of the body that we're trying to promote recovery in. We can see a reduction in lactic acid buildup in muscles, and oftentimes the lactic acid is something that can contribute to sort of that post-exercise soreness in muscles. So we often see a reduction in that post-exercise pain and fatigue as well. It can help kind of flush the muscles out, and it helps to remove some of the metabolic waste. So that lactic acid would be considered one of those metabolic waste products. So that active recovery, doing gentle kind of exercises and movements and increasing that blood flow can help to flush out that waste a little bit quicker so that we are promoting and getting faster recovery within the muscles. So active recovery can be a really important part of recovery. It doesn't just have to be passive. And so when we're thinking about how to incorporate recovery within our dancers, again, there's often a lot of kind of pushback and resistance to this idea of my dancers are going to get out of shape or they're going to lose conditioning and that sort of stuff if they're taking a break. And that's kind of a whole different discussion to have, because in reality, that is absolutely not going to happen. But if we are still concerned about that concept, one of the ways that we can maybe start to promote recovery within the industry and kind of deal with that myth a little bit is by really promoting that active recovery side of things. So it doesn't just have to be passive. That being said, passive recovery is also very important for the body, and this is where more of the repair that is going to happen in our body. So passive recovery is what we would consider sort of more complete physical rest. So the easiest kind of example of that, or what people often think about the most when they think about passive recovery, is sleeping. And I'm going to talk a bit more about sleep in a second, but it's not just sleep. There's other ways of passively recovering. So that might be things that that dancer might enjoy, like reading, listening to music, watching a movie, socializing with their friends. Things like that can all be considered recovery, because remember, recovery is not just for our physical body, it's also mental as well. We need to take a break from being fully immersed in the dance world at all times. So maybe going to watch a movie with friends fulfills that side of the passive recovery. You're sitting, you're relaxing, but you're also socializing with friends and watching a movie that you enjoy. So it's not just the physical side of things we need to consider. These types of things as well, like I kind of like referred to earlier, things like journaling prompts and stuff like that can be a really great way of incorporating a little bit more passive recovery into a classroom setting. So, maybe they're doing some self-reflection on the effort they put in or how they handled performance anxiety in a competition the previous weekend or things like that. You can be creative with that, but there's ways of including passive recovery in your class that's not just the dancers having a nap on the floor, which is maybe not the most productive use of your class time. And again, sleep is a super important part of passive recovery, but generally we want that to be happening at night in a bed in a more sort of structured sleep setting. So, like I sort of alluded to earlier, benefits of more passive recovery is when we see more of the sort of muscle repair or like repair of tissues happening within the body. We also see more metabolic recovery. So the active recovery, we'll see kind of flushing of metabolic waste products. But with more passive recovery, we're actually going to see recovery within the metabolic system. So being able to replenish and rebuild those metabolic stores. So for our energy systems, whether that's the aerobic energy system or the anaerobic energy system, we need to be able to replenish energy stores within those systems. And that's going to happen more with our passive recovery. Like I touched on, we really need passive recovery to have mental breaks from things. It's really important for us to remove ourselves from the dance setting periodically so that dancers can remember that they're whole humans and whole people and not just dancers. So sometimes it's easy for dancers to really get wrapped up in their dancer identity and forget that there's other parts to them. And so exploring other things like interests and socializing with friends and stuff is really important for our dancers to combat things like burnout. And then passive recovery, again, becomes even more important when we have dancers who are growing. So these are our younger adolescent dancers. It's even more important for them to have full rest and recovery days in their schedule where they have full days off of dance or doing kind of strenuous physical activity to allow their body time to grow. It is not a coincidence that we often see dancers go through like really major growth spurts when they have time off in the summer. So, kids will finish up the dance year in sort of, end of May, June, whenever that happens to be, and they'll go away for the summer and come back in sort of September, and teachers will be like, oh my goodness, they grew so much. And that is not a coincidence. That is their body having time to be able to grow because all of a sudden it's not being taxed so strenuously and it has time to focus on sort of that growth side of things. So having sort of periods of rest is really important for all dancers, but especially dancers who are growing and needing to have that benefit as well. So I just want to touch a little bit more on sleep because sleep is so important for a huge variety of things. Sleep could honestly be its own entire podcast episode, and maybe it will be at some point in the future. But when we think about passive recovery, sleep is a huge part of that. And most of our dancers, I would say, are chronically underslept. Anytime I go into studios and do workshops and we are talking about sort of injury prevention, injury reduction, things like that, we always touch on sleep, and we'll do like a little activity where I'll get dancers to kind of stand up, depending on how many hours of sleep they've had kind of in the previous night or how many hours of sleep they get on average per night. And it is not uncommon for a lot of dancers, and we're talking adolescent dancers here, to on average be getting sort of 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night. But we know from research, and I think even just common knowledge, when you then ask dancers how much sleep should they be getting per night, almost all of them will say that they should be getting 8 hours of sleep a night. So that number has sort of been thrown out for a long time, both within the research world and then also just kind of like, kind of more commonly, that people know that we should be getting more sleep. Again, if you're working with adolescent dancers, it is quite possible that they need even more than 8 hours of sleep. Some research studies have looked at, again, kind of like adolescent and growing kids. It wasn't a dance-specific study necessarily. And that research pointed to kind of the average amount of sleep that's required, or sort of that magic number being more like 9.25 hours of sleep. So just over 9 hours of sleep. And it's pretty unusual for our dancers nowadays to actually be getting that much sleep. So it's something that's worth discussing and thinking about with your dancers, and also when we're thinking about our schedules. So when we're making our studio schedules, and I know that this can be challenging because of studio space requirements, and it's often our older dancers that we can realistically expect to be at the studio later into the evening, but those are also our dancers who maybe have heavier homework loads and other commitments outside of dance as well. And so if they're not getting home from the studio until, say, 9:30, some dancers even 10 p.m. at night, then they still potentially need to eat dinner, do homework, shower, all of that. A lot of them are not getting into bed, anytime before midnight, and then they need to be up for school the next morning. So just something to think about is, are we setting these dancers up for success? Are the schedules that we are trying to impose on our dancers affecting their ability to get this sleep? I realize there's also lots of other factors that affect dancers being able to get appropriate amounts of sleep. And, there's lots of dancers who say, oh, I try and go to bed early, but then I end up on my phone kind of scrolling social media. And before I know it, an hour's passed and it's way later than I thought I was going to go to bed. And I know I'm certainly guilty of that sometimes as well. But it's definitely something we want to be talking about with our dancers and asking them about, and trying to make sure that dancers are getting adequate amounts of sleep. One study that has looked at this again wasn't specifically dancers, this was more in athletes, but it was in adolescent athletes. They looked at people who were what they termed chronically short of sleep or underslept. And so that was getting less than 8 hours of sleep per night. And those athletes or those adolescents were 58% more likely to sustain a musculoskeletal injury or like a sports injury. So that's a huge increase. So if we do nothing else in terms of like injury prevention or injury reduction, injury mitigation, other than try and promote our dancers all getting 8 hours of sleep a night, at least, ideally more in some cases potentially, we can potentially impact injury rates by up to 58%. That's a huge, huge number in an industry where we see really high injury rates. So just something to think about, that when we're talking about rest and recovery, that sleep part of things is really, really important for dancers to be trying to prioritize getting to bed early enough that they are able to get kind of adequate amounts of sleep over the course of the evening. So that's kind of more passive recovery. So we talked about active recovery, we talked about passive recovery, and I just want to talk really briefly about sort of what I often refer to as adjuncts. I always get questions about other sort of recovery therapies or tools or things that people can do to like enhance their recovery. And I'm just going to touch on some of those briefly. But before I get into those, I just want to sort of reiterate that all of the fancy tools and gadgets and recovery, strategies and things like that are really not ever going to make up for poor scheduling and sort of overtraining and the underutilization of rest and recovery. So if we have a dancer who's only dancing only sleeping 5 hours per night, no amount of any of these adjunct things is going to enhance their recovery enough that their body's going to be able to perform optimally. So I am going to discuss these, but I just want to sort of have that caveat that it's the basics of rest and recovery. So adequate sleep, having rest days in our schedule, taking advantage of like rest breaks, like winter break, spring break, summer break, things like that are going to move the dial so much more significantly than any of these kind of like other adjuncts that we're going to talk about. So what I would consider adjuncts for recovery are things that are often referred to as therapeutic techniques that enhance recovery. So these would be things like massage or myofascial release. A lot of dancers are familiar with myofascial release or self-myofascial release using like a foam roller or a lacrosse ball, or potentially those like what are they called? Like massage gun type things. So things like that can help with recovery. Mobility work would be considered sort of an adjunct to recovery. Breath work can be a really powerful tool that we can use to enhance recovery. Cryotherapy, so that's kind of cold therapy, and this is one that I often get a lot of questions about because it's quite popular right now, and we see it a lot in the athletic population, and so you'll see like a lot of professional athletes and stuff like that using cryotherapy, and there's various forms of it. So cryotherapy, I mean, using an ice pack on an area of your body, so say sticking an ice pack on your knee would be considered cryotherapy, but there's also more sophisticated types of this. Like now we're seeing professional athletes actually going into like these cryo chambers and using cold therapy that go into like sub-zero temperatures. So there's like sort of more fancy ways of utilizing cryotherapy. And then cold plunges are really common, or doing ice baths or ice buckets and things like that. So there is some evidence to support the use of cryotherapy in sort of recovery and injury healing and that type of thing. The one caveat that I will say to that, and this maybe doesn't apply as significantly to dancers just because strength training is not necessarily mainstream in the dance world, I will say. But if you're going through a specific strength program where you're really looking at kind of like hypertrophy within the muscles and things like that, then sometimes this cryotherapy can actually be counterproductive to that, because we actually need that sort of micro damage happening in muscles for the muscle to then repair and build up to like increase that strength. And cryotherapy is thought to be able to interrupt that process potentially, but that also is where some of the benefit comes from when we're looking at it more from like a recovery from session to session. So it can be useful if you have like performances today, let's say, and then you need to perform again tomorrow. So we're looking for more of this kind of just like, how can we most quickly decrease the amount of like post-exercise or post-strenuous activity soreness and things like that in muscles. Then cryotherapy, like an ice bath or something like that, could certainly be an adjunct that may enhance your recovery. So if it is something that you're like using or wanting to look into, I would just say look into it a little bit more carefully and know why you were using it and what phase of kind of training you were using cryotherapy in. Another one that I get asked about all the time is compression. And there are various forms of compression. So there's kind of more what we would consider static compression. So that would be like a compression sock or compression sleeve or other types of like kind of compression garments. But something that's become more common and more popular in recent years is what we call pneumatic compression, or sometimes pneumatic intermittent compression. And some of you may have seen these kind of like recovery boot type things. There's a few different companies that produce them, but you'll see dancers or athletes or things like that are like in these, they just look like giant boots that basically go all the way up like to the top of your thigh, and then they have like a pump action within them. And so they're using this pneumatic compression to kind of like enhance circulation and try and enhance recovery in that sense. So there are different types of compression, and compression can be useful in recovery. So those are just a few examples of some adjunct things that we sometimes use to try and increase recovery. But again, just because it's such an important concept, I'm going to reiterate that if you're not already doing the basics well, like incorporating rest days and sleeping 8 hours a night and all of that, no amount of like cryotherapy or compression therapy or things like that is going to replace you not sleeping and letting your body rest and recover in that sense. So just the benefits of some of these adjunct therapies, I kind of touched on some of these briefly, but basically we'll see a reduction in muscle soreness. We often see improved blood flow and circulation to the muscles. We'll see decreased stress and increased relaxation. And we can also help to stimulate the autonomic nervous system, so specifically the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of like rest and relax side of the system. And so things like that breath work and stuff like that can be really helpful for that. And then there's some thought that potentially we see a reduction in inflammation. You'll see some of the research around cryotherapy or even some of the pneumatic compression therapies talking about reduction in inflammation. But that research is, I would say, inconclusive at best. So I would take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, depending on what kind of research you're looking at, whether that is going to be sort of a benefit. So we don't necessarily think of we don't think of reduction of inflammation being the primary benefit. Some of these other things that we're seeing in terms of like reduced muscle soreness and increased circulation are really probably what we're going after when we're using these adjuncts when it comes to rest and recovery. So I am going to wrap things up there in terms of talking about rest and recovery, but I hope that you have found that helpful and it's given you a moment to pause and think about what are ways that I can be promoting more rest and recovery, either within my own dance practice or if you're a teacher within your students' dance practice. And I think the industry as a whole really could benefit and is sort of at the point where we need to start to prioritize rest and recovery within a dancer's schedule. There is this idea sort of floating around, and it's been circulating within the last week on social media as well, that like more is not better, like better is better. So when we're talking about training quality or just like training in general, I think sometimes there's still this idea that dancers are like, well, I just need to be doing more. I need to practice more. I need to rehearse more. I need to train more. And that's how I'm going to improve. But realistically, if you're not allowing your body time to rest and recover in between, you are not going to improve no matter how many hours you're putting in and how hard you're working. So it's just as important as how hard you're working in class is how hard you're sort of training recovery and allowing your body to recover. And you're going to see the most improvements and the most success within your dance if we're also honoring the body and allowing it time to rest and recover. So I will leave things there. If you found this episode helpful, I would really encourage you to share it with a friend, share it with a fellow dance teacher, share it with your own dance teacher if you are a dancer. If you're a dance parent, share it with other dance parents, and hopefully we can slowly start to change the culture within the dance industry so people will really start to appreciate and implement more rest and recovery strategies, and we can get away from this mentality of more all the time. So thank you so much for being here today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.